In the 2000s, the journalist Scott Jones visited the grave of Brian Jones at Cheltenham Cemetery and Crematorium in England. Brian Jones was a founding member of the Rolling Stones who died in 1969, and Scott, who is of no relation to Brian, was simply a fan paying his respects. But suddenly he noticed something by the grave. A written message was left from a Rolling Stones fan promising to search for the truth about his death. Scott was intrigued and decided to look into it himself, and unknowingly unraveled one of the most mysterious deaths in music history. To a modern music fan, it might come as a surprise that at one point in time, the most popular member of the Rolling Stones was not Mick Jagger or Keith Richards, but Brian Jones. Brian was the founding member of the band, and much to Mick Jagger's dismay, most of their female fan mail was addressed directly to Brian. The Rolling Stones originally started as a rhythm and blues band and performed mainly covers when they started in 1962. As the band grew, their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, decided to shift their direction. He had previously worked as a publicist for the Beatles and wanted the Stones to be the bad boy alternative to him. A British tabloid newspaper famously wrote, "Would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone?" And Oldham embraced that line and turned it into the band's promotional slogan. Oldham also got the Stones to write their own songs, most of which came from Mick and Keith, and this took the spotlight away from Brian. That being said, Jones was an important member of the Stones throughout the 60s. He was an excellent guitarist and multi-instrumentalist, and his excessive drug use and womanizing ways complemented the band's image as someone who you didn't want marrying your daughter. In the late 60s, Jones had a spiraling drug addiction and was becoming more and more isolated from the band. In November of 1968, he moved to an area of the English countryside known as Cotchford Farm in the British county of Sussex. This was the previous home of A.A. Milne, who wrote the original Winnie the Pooh books, and it was this very farm that inspired some of these stories. There was a certain irony that the most excessive member of the Rolling Stones was now living in the home once occupied by a wholesome children's author. However, Jones' excessive drug use got to the stage where he was in no shape to perform in the studio or travel on the lucrative tours that the Rolling Stones had planned. On June 8, 1969, Brian was visited by Mick, Keith, and their drummer Charlie Watts. He was informed that he was being kicked out of what was once his own band. Less than a month later, Brian was found dead inside his own swimming pool. The coroner put it down to misadventure, and his well-documented drug addiction seemed to have gotten the better of him. When Scott Jones visited the grave of Brian Jones, he was a journalist working with the BBC. The 2000s was also when people had ready access to the internet and could find alternative theories about Brian's death on the dark corners of the web. On the night of Brian's death, he had 4 other visitors in his home. Among these include Rolling Stones tour manager Tom Keelock and his girlfriend Janet Lawson, Brian's girlfriend Anna Wolin, and Frank Thorogood, who was a builder on the farm. On the night of Brian's death, all 4 of them gave consistent statements to the police that Brian had been drinking and taking sleeping tablets. Scott first made contact with Janet Lawson, and she was willing to speak with him. In fact, despite the fact that this had happened over 30 years ago, she was desperate to get something off her chest. After Brian's death, she was taken to a police station where she gave her statement. She told Scott, "The police were trying to put words in my mouth. They kept saying, 'Did this happen, or did it happen like this?' I was very tired. It was about 4 or 5 in the morning. I wanted to know if I would be able to give another statement later on because I was tired, confused, and nervous. They said yes. So when the police asked me to give this statement and they were suggesting all these things to me, I eventually said, yeah, to bring it to a close. I thought I would have another chance to give a statement where I could be clearer." She initially told the police that she was in Brian's house because she decided to spend a few days in the country. However, she told Scott that it was really to keep an eye on Brian. Her boyfriend said that there was tension between Brian Jones and his builder, Frank Thorogood. Frank was not doing the building work properly. Brian had sacked or fired him that day. There was something in the air. Frank was acting strangely, throwing his weight around a bit. Brian and his visitors had dinner together in the early evening, and afterward, Brian and Frank spent some time in the swimming pool. While Brian was in the pool, he asked Janet to go grab his asthma inhaler. I went to look for it by the pool, in the music room, the reception room, and then the kitchen. Frank came in a lather. His hands were shaking. He was in a terrible state. I thought the worst almost straight away and went to the pool to check. When I saw Brian on the bottom of the pool and was calling for help, Frank initially did nothing. I shouted for Frank again as I ran towards the house, and he burst out before I reached it, ran to the pool and instantly dived in. But I had not said where Brian was. I thought, how did he know Brian was at the bottom of the pool? I ran back to the house and tried to call 999, but Anna was on the phone and would not get off it. Most of these details were absent from Janet's police statement. Scott addressed the elephant in the room and asked her if Brian was killed by Frank. Her answer was, yes. She said, "I went into the house to look for Brian's inhaler. Frank jumped back in the pool, did something to Brian, and by the time I came back, Brian was lying peacefully on the bottom of the pool with not a ripple in the water. I think because of the state that Frank was in, something had to have happened. I mean, why would Frank have been standing in the kitchen absolutely terrified if something hadn't happened?" Janet describes the event as not a murder, but horseplay that got out of hand. After her interview with Scott, Janet was tragically diagnosed with terminal cancer. Scott said that this was not a deathbed confession, but when he visited her in hospital, her response was, "I've done it now, and I feel better for it." Janet's old boyfriend, Tom Salek, was also in ill health when Scott reached out to him and refused to comment. But Scott received important information from the police officers who arrived that night. Scott also spoke to PC Albert Evans, who was the first police officer on the scene. His recollection supports what Janet said. He believes there was some sort of altercation, drug-induced, alcohol-induced. It was Frank Thorogood who was mentioned. He was the one who had been in the pool with Brian Jones. There was nothing at the time to connect Thorogood with anymore, just feelings. I'm sure that Bob Marshall, the chief investigating officer, had those feelings very strongly. I shared these views with him. I think he said exactly the same to me. Evans had already raised issues about his death before. In 1994, he sent a letter to the head of police in Sussex which read, "I personally was not convinced that we were given the correct story, as put forward by Thorogood." However, Evans had no evidence to support this other than what he calls a policeman's instinct. Scott then spoke to the second police officer on the scene, PC Mike Harvey. His recollection maybe points to a bit more than horseplay that got out of hand. He found 5 capsules of the drug Durafet in Thorogood's coat. Thorogood told Harvey, "I'll look after them for Brian so that he won't take too many at a time." Thorogood was in possession of illegal drugs, but was merely given a caution. According to Harvey, a caution was quite unusual in those days. We were trying to stamp down hard on drugs, so we couldn't say, just forget it. But given the circumstances, it didn't justify court proceedings. That was a decision made by a senior officer. Harvey's statements about these drugs were not presented to the coroner, and to Scott, this looked as if the police were, for some reason, protecting Thorogood. Another police officer spoke to Scott but wished to remain anonymous. The officer told him about Anna Wolin, Brian Jones' then-girlfriend. Just like Janet, she gave her statement in a poor state of mind. This was obviously a highly traumatic incident, and she gave her police statement when she was on sedatives. The anonymous police officer said, Wolin had been given sedatives by the doctor and had to be actually woken up during the interview. The WDC who wrote that statement was told what to write by Bob Marshall. Bob Marshall was controlling it. The evidence that was written down, he was pushing the buttons. Bob Marshall denies these accusations and insists that Brian Jones simply drowned inside his pool. But the anonymous police officer said that Marshall was simply following orders from higher up. He suggests that the chief constable or head of police was calling the shots. This anonymous police officer said, if the chief constable knew drugs had been found in the house, you'd expect him to say, I want the man charged. Yet Thorogood was cautioned. You wouldn't do that unless you knew the chief constable was backing you. It was decided this information about the drugs would not be given to the coroner. It's outrageous. Bob Marshall said Frank Thorogood was never a suspect because he didn't have it in him to be violent. Scott Jones would find pretty damning evidence that this was not the case. In 1969, Thorogood was a married man but was conducting an affair with a woman named Joanne Fitzsimmons. She was a cab driver in the surrounding area and regularly drove Brian Jones and Keith Richards in her car. On July 26, 1969, 3 weeks after Brian Jones had died, Joan Fitzsimmons was viciously assaulted. She was left in a coma with a fractured skull and blinded for life. And according to police records, Thorogood was a suspect. One letter from the head of police in Sussex said, she is to be asked as to her reason for allegedly being afraid of Mr. Francis Thorogood as referred to in a statement of her brother Mr. John Russell, and what knowledge she has relating to the death of Brian Jones which causes her to be frightened. In light of the statement of Mr. John Russell, inquiries are to be made and statements taken to eliminate Mr. Francis Thorogood as being in the Chichester area between 8:30 p.m. and 9:55 p.m. on the 26th July 1969, and with having anything to do with the assault on Mrs. Fitzsimmons. Scott Jones received these documents through Freedom of Information requests. However, the statement from John Russell was not in these documents. Irene Russell, the mother of Joan and John, said, Joan told me that Frank was causing trouble by trying to get her back. Frank was very persistent. Frank said to me that Joan knows a lot about the Rolling Stones that shouldn't get out. Joan, as it appeared to me, was frightened of Frank. However, Frank's wife and 2 friends confirmed that he was in London on July 26th. The convicted perpetrator turned out to be her boyfriend, Michael Ziadeh, who pleaded guilty to attempted murder. He spent 4 years behind bars in a British prison and was deported to his native country of Jordan afterward. When news came out about this assault, Janet Lawson went into hiding. She told Scott, "I knew it was no coincidence. I felt there was some link with Frank. I went into hiding at my brother's house on an RAF Royal Air Force base. Beyond those walls and security fences, that was the only place I had where they couldn't get to me." By they, Lawson more innocently meant the media. Tom Keelock's decision not to participate in Scott Jones' investigation is unfortunate. In 1993, it's alleged that Thorogood, who was on his deathbed with cancer, confessed the killing of Brian Jones to Tom. In the 1994 book, Who Killed Christopher Robbins? The Truth Behind the Death of a Rolling Stone, Thorogood reportedly said, "It was me that did Brian. I just finally snapped." Keelock reportedly stated this happened, but later denied he ever said it. Terry Rawlings, who wrote the book, thinks this wasn't a deathbed confession, but claims that Tom knew all along too. In a TV interview, Terry Rawlings said, "Tom says he was told years later in like a deathbed confession, which I've never ever believed because if it was very conveniently tied up in that way. My theory is that he's known all along." The big question is, if so, why did he do it? According to Rawlings, there was a financial dispute between the two. Rawlings said, "The more you sort of looked into it, it became quite obvious what happened. There's no real mystery, really. Guy gets sacked or fired on a Thursday night when builders used to get paid on Thursday nights. His money stopped. He's owed a lot of money." Brian Jones paid Thorogood £18,000 for work on the farm, and Thorogood wanted another £6,000 from Brian. £6,000 in 1969 is equivalent to £67,000 today, or roughly $84,000 US. It wasn't a premeditated thing at all. I think he died as a result of a massive falling out which happened twice that night. The result was he died, so something, not misadventure as such, but certainly manslaughter, I would say. Jeffrey Giuliano, an American journalist, published a book around the same time in 1994 called Paint It Black: Murder of Brian Jones. You also might recognize Jeffrey as VIP4 in the Netflix series Squid Game. His theory on why Brian was killed is a lot wilder. In an interview for Fox News, he said, "Choreographing the sequence of events that night was Tom Keelock. Brian started the Rolling Stones. He put an ad in the newspaper saying, 'I want to audition musicians from my band, the Rolling Stones.' He owned the name. I believe that Tom Keelock, in an attempt to ingratiate himself to his masters, not at the behest of the Rolling Stones, but to try to go up in the ladder, he was an uneducated guy. He was a brute, a thug. He cooked up this plan to murder Brian Jones." Scott Jones, however, believes that the financial dispute between Thorogood and Brian was the less exciting but more plausible motive. In 1999, another book was published about Brian's death entitled The Murder of Brian Jones, and the co-author of this book was Anna Wallen, who, as you may recall, was Brian Jones' girlfriend and was there on that night. She told the BBC at the time, "I felt I wanted to tell what really happened, mainly for the sake of his son and his closest friends who also believed he died when he was on drugs. That wasn't true. I knew what was going on." In 2008, Scott Jones published all of his new information in the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, and presented his information to the police. And a year later, the British police force said that they would reinvestigate the death of Brian Jones, partially in light of what Janet Lawson said. But sadly, nothing came of this. 10 years later, the documentary Rolling Stone: Life and Death of Brian Jones shed some light on the events. A possible reason for why the police were so sketchy is that they messed up and they were simply covering up their own mistakes. If it was found that they had failed to accurately assess a potential murder of one of the Rolling Stones, they would be in real hot water. In this documentary, never-before-seen footage from Keelock was released. He said, "I think the police wanted to make a manslaughter charge, but they were told to forget it. The only one who could possibly have been charged was Frank Thorogood, because he was the only one in the pool. But the police said, just forget it. The orders came from the very top not to pursue it anymore, and it never was pursued after that." The biggest obstacle for most journalists looking into this case is the official reports. All of the reports involving Brian's death are subject to a 75-year rule, meaning that they will not be released until 75 years have passed since his death, in the year 2044. With the passage of time, it looks like Brian Jones' death might never get the full investigation that he deserved. Rather fittingly, the final Rolling Stones album Brian Jones had appeared on had a song titled, "You Can't Always Get What You Want." Make sure to subscribe for more.